Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we shortcut information overload. We take the best nuggets from a stack of sources and bring them directly to you.
And today, we're getting into something really thorny.
Yeah, a truly uncomfortable, universal human paradox. One that I think forces us to look pretty hard at our own inconsistent demands on authority.
It is thorny
Yeah.
because it lives right at that intersection of our deepest desire for freedom
Correct.
and our most basic need for survival.
Right?
So the mission for you, the listener, is to maybe diagnose why we flip-flop so completely when the pressure is on.
Okay, so think about the moment-to-moment experience of living in a regulated society. We are constantly, seeking ways to simplify, to cut red tape. We criticize laws as cumbersome, annoying, or out of touch.
We fight bureaucracy every single day. We've normalized that critique. We're skilled at spotting the friction points, the outdated rules, all the administrative delays.
And we celebrate the person who can get around them.
We elevate the individual who can cleverly navigate or just plain ignore those frictions.
Yeah. But then, the switch flips. A major event happens. A natural disaster, a sudden social shock, an accident that makes the world feel fundamentally fragile.
That feeling,
Yeah.
that feeling that everything could break apart at any time becomes real.
And what's the first question? The immediate, almost instinctive question. It's not, how can I help?
No, it's where is the state? Why is no one controlling this? It's a rapid-fire demand for structure.
From the very same authority we were just mocking a minute ago.
So the core mission today, it's existential, it's not political. It's about understanding to what extent we demand absolute fail-safe protection.
Without being willing to accept the constraints that actually guarantee it.
Exactly. We're exploring that mental shift from rules are annoying to why isn't anyone in charge?
Okay, so let's unpack that. This core conflict between freedom and security. Our sources highlight that we absolutely hate structure when things are stable, when we feel safe enough to assert our individuality.
But we seek that structure instantly, desperately, the moment our sense of security vanishes.
The demand for structure only appears when fear shows up.
And that's a crucial distinction. We often confuse freedom with safety. Or, more accurately, we conflate freedom with the absence of constraint.
I see.
If we bring in the perspective of someone like Albert Camus here, he would ask a really cold, clear question.
Which is?
What definition of freedom are you holding on to that makes you resent the very conditions that allow you to walk down the street without fear?
Wow. That suggests we aren't fighting oppression, we're just fighting inconvenience.
Precisely. We probably don't hate law itself. We hate the feeling of being limited when we don't perceive an immediate threat.
So the law only becomes worthy of our attention.
Yes, worthy of being named and called upon only when the danger is visible and tangible, when the building is actually on fire.
And this creates a continuous, just agonizing internal contradiction for the modern individual.
It does.
We want protection, we know deep down we need it, but we refuse to admit that need.
Because admitting need feels like admitting weakness or dependency.
And this refusal leads to what the sources call existential exhaustion.
Think about it. Think about the mental energy you spend trying to game the system, looking for those shortcuts, trying to prove that you are the exception to the rule.
All that energy is just wasted.
It is. And then when a crisis hits, you spend an equal amount of energy demanding the system you just tried to game step up and save you.
It sounds absolutely exhausting.
It is.
You're constantly switching roles from this fiercely independent rebel to the panicked, dependent citizen.
You never establish a stable position. You're caught between wanting the shelter and denying the dependency. You're always fighting the structure, whether it's there or not.
Let's get into the psychological root of that resistance.
Okay, the source material has a fascinating insight here, based on behavioral studies.
Ooh.
It takes, on average, about 7 minutes before a person starts feeling agitated about a new regulation.
7 minutes, that's no time at all.
And often, the agitation isn't because the rule is harsh or cruel. It's because the rule triggers a much deeper existential fear.
The sudden realization that someone else is deciding for me.
Exactly. So it's not the rule itself, it's the perceived loss of agency.
That feeling that the law is slowly turning the controls of my own life over to some nameless, faceless authority, that's a deep fear for an individual raised on the idea of ultimate personal autonomy.
And this fear gets amplified because, as society grows more complex, the gap between what you do as an individual and the collective consequence it widens dramatically.
So you take a shortcut around a planning regulation, or you run a red light late at night.
And you don't immediately see how that decision impacts the larger shared infrastructure.
You feel isolated from the consequences, and that creates this dangerous illusion that law is external to my life.
Right. It's there to manage other people.
This is where Franz Kafka's observations become so relevant.
It is. He described humans feeling surrounded by rules, by these, endless, nameless corridors, but never seeing the face of the person who actually set them.
When the law becomes invisible, when it's just a digital fine or some incomprehensible form,
It stops feeling like a mutual agreement that you participate in. It starts feeling like anonymous pressure.
it's the feeling of trying to appeal a parking ticket. You know the rule exists, but the system is designed so you can never actually speak to a human being.
Exactly. And the natural reaction to that kind of anonymous pressure is resistance.
But not a big revolution.
No, it manifests in small, daily acts. Ignoring the speed limit slightly, avoiding a complex procedure, mocking the bureaucracy. You normalize the idea of being the smart person who's the exception.
And culture strongly reinforces this normalization, which brings us to the glorification of the rule breaker.
The flexible individual, the one who just gets things done.
Our sources confirm this is deeply embedded in how we tell stories. Modern culture, prestige media, they rarely elevate the character who meticulously follows procedure,
No, the protagonist is often the one who knows the shortcut, who isn't tied down by procedure.
or who defies the system to get a morally gray but, satisfying result. Law is framed as the boring, slow obstacle to success.
And this leads to the central self-defeating contradiction. And you really need to hear this clearly.
Okay.
We want ourselves to be the exception. We need that feeling of individual flexibility, of moral superiority.
We need everyone else to comply absolutely for the system to function stably.
If we all drove like the protagonist in an action movie, we'd have gridlock and tragedy.
So we're demanding the collective structure deliver two contradictory things at the same time.
Maximum personal freedom for me.
And absolute rigid security guaranteed by everyone else's compliance.
And that, when you demand that two mutually exclusive concepts exist in the same space, is the very definition of absurdity, to use Camus's term.
It's not that people are inherently bad.
No, it's that we are living in a structure that imposes this impossible double demand on us. And that leads to constant frustration.
And the moment the law really starts to lose its moral weight, that's when people stop trusting its consistency.
Absolutely. If a massive, serious incident is strictly handled and punished, but a similar incident, maybe involving a powerful person, is quietly ignored,
The whole question shifts.
the conversation stops being, what does the law say? And it shifts entirely to who is protected and who is not.
And when that fairness is eroded, compliance is no longer based on a shared belief in the rule.
It becomes based purely on fear of consequence. And if that consequence is unclear or easily dodged or selective, compliance vanishes overnight.
And we see this play out so well, or maybe horribly, in what the source calls the flexible reality trap. When flexibility benefits you in daily life, say a small regulation is ignored and it speeds up your project, you call that reality, or good common sense.
But the moment that same flexibility causes harm, say, a tragedy results from loose oversight on a bridge construction,
You immediately shift your moral judgment.
and you call it loose management or irresponsible governance.
It's the same fundamental behavior, flexibly applying rules, but you just change the context, and suddenly your moral framework flips to the opposite pole.
You lack patience for the law when there's no crisis, but you see its necessity only in the chaotic aftermath.
This whole paradox seems manageable when things are stable, but the sources show that the entire structure just implodes when chaos hits.
So what does that demand look like when order starts to shake?
Well, when chaos strikes, the crowd immediately seeks an address to name. Where is the state? Why is no one managing this?
It's a natural collective reflex. People need a visible center of power, an anchor for their safety, when everything else feels unstable.
That search for an anchor is profoundly human, but the danger is when and where we ask that question.
Right. When the state is only called upon in crisis, a critical piece of the social contract just going, it evaporates.
Which piece?
Individual responsibility. The state becomes a convenient symbol for order, but also a giant sponge for all our difficult, messy questions.
We tend to push all those questions onto this abstract structure, the state, the law, rather than keeping the portion of responsibility that's within our own reach.
It's so much easier to say the system failed than I made a contribution to this failure.
And the consequence is the shrinking of the individual. When the system is given too much of a saving role,
The individual becomes smaller, less capable, and it makes it frighteningly easy to say, that's not my job, that's the government's job.
we delegate responsibility for our safety, which is also, it's delegating responsibility for our freedom.
And it leaves the state in a complete no-win scenario, caught in a perpetual cycle of contradiction.
So after a crisis, society demands stricter laws, tighter control, more surveillance, more safety nets.
But then, almost immediately, they complain bitterly about being over-controlled, regulated, and constrained.
It's the tragedy of power in an absurd world. Too strict is rigid, not strict enough is irresponsible.
We demand a savior and then punish it for being too powerful.
Okay, let's unpack this and shift to application. We've identified the paradox, the psychology, the cultural reinforcement. If we accept this reality, how do we live with structure without lying to ourselves?
And without achieving this existential exhaustion.
Yeah. We pulled 4 tough, fundamental strategies from the sources.
Okay, strategy number 1. You have to reset your expectations. Law is risk reduction, not a moral promise.
That's a huge shift in mindset. What does that mean, practically?
If you approach law with the expectation that it must provide absolute justice, eliminate all tragedy, and protect everyone perfectly, you will always be angry. You'll always feel betrayed.
We're asking a human tool to deliver divine perfection.
Precisely. Law can only do one thing well: reduce the level of chaos. View it like the guardrails on a mountain road. They reduce the probability of disaster, but they don't promise you'll never swerve.
When you see it as a tool to mitigate shared risk, your frustration declines.
And your engagement increases.
Strategy 2, accept the consequences of critique. Critiquing the law without accepting the consequences of that critique is not freedom, it's quite simply entitlement.
You don't critique a safety regulation just to feel superior or to save 5 minutes. You critique it because you genuinely believe it's counterproductive, and you have to understand the price of challenging that structure. If you demand deregulation in finance, you must be prepared for more market volatility.
If you demand fewer building codes, you accept higher risk during an earthquake.
That awareness of the trade-off is the cost of maturity.
Strategy 3, don't use law as an excuse for personal irresponsibility. Law cannot make you decent.
It cannot force you to be responsible when no one is watching. When the camera's off and the consequence is distant, the law is the minimum standard, not the moral maximum.
So when you blame every failure entirely on the law or the state,
You diminish your own sphere of influence. A society made of small, shrinking individuals who wait for the system to govern their conscience will always need a larger, more intrusive system to control them.
responsibility has to start with the individual, not end with the state.
Right. And that brings us to strategy 4, which the sources highlight as the most existentially difficult.
The core acceptance.
We have to accept living within limits we did not choose. This is an unavoidable fact of collective life.
We spend so much energy fighting the frame of our lives, refusing to acknowledge the boundaries.
Existential maturity isn't about eliminating limits or denying them. It's about being fully aware of which limits you live within, the laws of physics, the needs of your community, the rules of the road, and still choosing to act responsibly within that frame.
Even if the system is imperfect.
Even then, you learn to live with law not out of grudging fear, but out of the understanding that shared order is necessary for collective survival.
Which is the prerequisite for your individual freedom.
Exactly.
So the ultimate shift, then, is realizing that the promised land isn't a society without rules.
No, nor is it a system where every rule is perfect and fair. The true promised land is a state of being where you stop needing to view the law as an enemy to feel individual.
And you stop viewing the state as a savior to relieve your fear.
It's a very humble state. You know the conditions you live under, and you choose not to deceive yourself about them.
So when we mature, when we stop living in that absurd contradiction,
We stop asking who is responsible instead of me.
and we start asking what part of the responsibility is mine, even if the system is imperfect.
Because here's the final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Go on.
Law doesn't exist to make you feel free. It exists so that you don't have to live in perpetual fear. The real question is, if tomorrow brought no crisis, no accident, and no reason to panic, would we still be willing to live with the common limits we demand must save us when everything collapses?
The hardest task is not building better laws or demanding the state respond better. The hardest task is to stop living as though order is only something we require when we are afraid, and start understanding that structure is the mundane, necessary price of a life lived outside the panic.